Hi, today I'm going to be showing you how to make egg glair. The materials you'll need to make egg glair are a glass palette. This one is plexiglass so that I can transport it easier. A mixer, you can use a hand mixer or a standing mixer as well. Some sort of container to mix the egg white in. I like using these yogurt containers because it can perfectly fit with my mixing blades. And then it's easy to store overnight because you'll need to cover it later. This comes with its own cover. Safety-wise, you definitely want to be wearing gloves. As well, if you don't have any pigment suspensions and are working with any dry pigment whatsoever, always wear a mask. The better the mask, the better safety you'll have. So if you have a respirator, dust mask, just wear something. Next we have a spray bottle for water. I'm going to be using 2 eggs today, some cups, palette knives, and here I have a pigment suspension, which is just pigment, powdered pigment and water. And here is egg glair that I made last week. This amount of egg glair comes from 2 eggs. Okay, so you're going to need to take 2 containers and 1 of your eggs. First you crack the egg, and so you want your egg whites to go into the larger container. Split it in half. You know, this is a lot like, cooking. If you've ever separated egg yolk from egg white, you just pass it back and forth. Pretty simple way to do it. And then you can gently save your egg yolk in a separate container if you do egg tempera painting or any other use for, well, mine broke, but that's okay for now. We're just focusing on the egg whites. That's all we're going to need. This is pretty... Alright, that wasn't pretty, but got the job done. There we go. So now you don't need these, so put them somewhere else. Egg glair only uses the egg white when you just get it out of the shell. Is pretty goopy, pretty stringy, so this wouldn't be a very good binder for paint. It's just too inconsistent of a texture. So what we're going to do is we're going to whip the egg white until it becomes like a meringue. So you take your mixer and put it in, and you want to whip it on a pretty high speed. See, it's got soft peaks. I'm going to whip it a little bit harder. I'd say that looks good. So when you take your mixing blades out of the mixture, there should be little stiff peaks that form. This is what we have left after we've whipped the egg whites. It kind of helped to make the consistency more even, and so now, and it aerates it. But this isn't what we need. What we need to do now is leave this container, cover it, leave it there overnight, just sitting out on the counter. And then what will happen next is that the meringue, the whipped egg white that we have, will become stiff, and there will be a liquid that looks like this that settles at the bottom. And all you need to do is take your container after it's settled overnight and pour off this liquid into a separate container, and that is your egg glair. Some people say that you have to either use a very fine cheesecloth or a strainer. I'm sure a coffee filter would work to pour out the stiff, like now sort of dry egg white meringue mixture, so that the liquid becomes pure and clear. But I didn't have any issue just pouring it out because the meringue becomes so stiff that it just really stays where it's supposed to, and the liquid just pours out. Next, we're going to make the paint. So we're going to combine the egg glair with a pigment suspension, which is dry pigment, powdered pigment, ground up with water. I'm not wearing a mask because when the pigment is in a suspension, the particles aren't in the air, but I highly, highly recommend that you wear a mask anytime you're dealing with any kind of dry powdered pigment. Always wear gloves though, because it can still be absorbed through the skin. So I'm going to take a little bit of this suspension that I previously made, just a small amount, as well as a little bit of our glair. The consistency is sort of like an ink, or somewhere in between like gouache and watercolor, but it's a little bit more sticky than that. So if you like working with thin paint, it's definitely worth a try. This was mostly used in for making illuminated manuscripts back in medieval times. So here we go. Kind of like sticky. What I read is that you definitely want to keep it as thin as possible because it has a tendency to crack off if you layer too much, if it becomes too thick. But you can see that it really allows the color of the pigment to be really strong. It's semi-opaque. Really can allow for some brilliant images. And I'm just doing this on watercolor paper. You could do it on, I've heard people doing it on vellum. Clearly in the old days they were using stuff like sheepskin, parchment paper. Watercolor paper works just fine. You want to make sure that once your paint is dry, that you just take your finger, your gloved finger, and run it over the paint to make sure that no pigment comes up onto your finger. If it does, that means you're not using enough of the binder, of the glair. You should just adjust your ratio to having more glair, a little less pigment. Alright, so that's it. Egg glair was used to paint in illuminated manuscripts. It was used to adhere gold leaf, and it can be used as a varnish for egg tempera painting, which uses the yolk. One more thing to add is that this egg glair mixture holds up a lot better than egg yolk if you're used to working in egg tempera. You can keep it covered in the fridge for a while. I've been leaving mine out and it's still fine. It doesn't really have any smell to it at all. They say that actually the longer you leave it out, the older it is, the better it becomes. I made this last week. I'll let you know a month from now if it's still good. They say that if you can deal with the smell of it in a month, it actually becomes like a completely different consistency that's more pleasant to work with. We'll see. Thanks.